chapter of America's Future Foundation. I would like to thank everybody for coming to what is sure to be a fun event tonight. America's Future Foundation is a nationwide network for young liberty-minded professionals. The Atlanta chapter of America's Future Foundation was founded just over 2 years ago. We host monthly events covering a varied range of topics, including immigration, the war on drugs, education policy, and economics. Our events are always open to the public and are free to attend. At the end of last year, America's Future Foundation received a very generous grant from the Arthur N. Root Foundation for the purpose of holding debates in 4 cities. The leadership of the Atlanta chapter is honored to be one of the 4 cities participating in these debates. The issue of public subsidies for privately owned sports stadiums is certainly a hot issue these days, especially here in Atlanta, where 2 of our teams will soon be moving into new stadiums that are going to be partially funded with taxpayer funds. Because of the attention that this issue has been receiving here in Atlanta, our leadership team felt that a debate on this issue would be a great opportunity to introduce economic thinking to sports. Today's debate features Dr. Bruce Seaman of Georgia State University and Dr. Victor Matheson of the College of the Holy Cross. It will be moderated by Mr. Denver, who is the Director of Programs and Alumni Relations at the Foundation for Economic Education. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy.
Well, thanks, Fred, and thanks to everyone who's attending this evening, especially a call out to all those folks out in internet land who are watching this on a live stream, both on americasfuture.org and on the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's website. Hello to everyone out there. Like Fred said, my name is Richard Lawrence. I'm the Director of Programs and Alumni Relations at the Foundation for Economic Education. And he's been around for almost 70 years, inspiring, educating, and connecting young people to the ideas of a free society. And one of the ways in which we do that is through our Summer Seminars program. And incidentally, we actually have some openings at our summer seminars happening all throughout the country this summer. And if you're interested or know a college student who is interested in these programs, our applications are open until Monday. Just go to our website at fee.org to learn more about those opportunities. So one of the reasons that FEE does the work it does is to educate young people on how they can apply economic thinking in their everyday lives. And what better way to explore everyday economic thinking than from the vantage point of tonight's debate? As most everywhere, sports are really, really big in Georgia. We have the Atlanta Falcons, the Atlanta Braves, and are soon going to have a Major League Soccer team in a couple of years. We're also the site of the 1996 Centennial Olympic Games. Now, sports are fun to watch, they're fun to play, they boost pride in the city or state, and are valuable businesses, which is why among sports' biggest fans are politicians. And they have been, of course, at least since Rome's circuses and gladiator fights. Now, according to Deadspin, 78 stadiums were built in the U.S. from 1991 to 2004, and a cost of $85 billion. Now, 61% of that cost was borne by taxpayers. In the rare case in which direct taxpayer subsidies aren't provided, such as in the case of Dodger Field in LA, subsidies take the form of eminent domain. Now, the focus of tonight's debate is not why politicians insert themselves into sports or the moral implications of their doing so. Rather, we're delving into the economic justifications for why politicians in the business they run, which is government, put millions of taxpayer dollars into stadium construction. Our debate will not focus on the new Atlanta Falcons or the Braves stadiums, but we encourage everyone to apply what they learned here tonight to think about those current events. So I'm going to introduce the question that we're going to be debating tonight, and then I'll introduce our speakers, and then I'll introduce exactly what order we're going to pursue things this evening. The actual question that we're talking about this evening is this: public subsidies for sports stadiums can generate net regional economic benefits. Now, Dr. Bruce Seaman from Georgia State will be supporting the resolution, and Professor Matheson from the College of the Holy Cross will oppose. Now let me give you a bit of an introduction on our 2 debaters this evening. Professor Seaman is a former staff economist and consultant for the Federal Trade Commission. He serves as a consultant in private antitrust, business contractual dispute, and civil tort cases. His research includes models of arts industry funding, which is called cultural economics, or at least is part of that, pricing discrimination, private and public school choice, cost-benefit analyses, and economic impact methodologies. His articles have appeared in pretty much every journal that you can think of, including I was talking with him earlier, there's a Spanish journal that he contributes to.
But that's not true. That part is true about Spanish, but not every journal you can think of.
Including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Socioeconomics, and Public Finance Quarterly. He's an associate professor of economics at Georgia State and received his Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago. I also learned that he believes that Georgia's worst export recently has been NHL franchises. So
you can
talk about that later. Dr. Victor Matheson specializes in sports economics, specifically the economic impact of mega sporting events on their host cities, public finance, the economics of lotteries and gambling, and natural resource economics. His sports economics research, which dispels the notion that major events such as the Olympics equal large economic dividends for host cities, has made him a widely sought-after expert on the subject. He's provided expert commentary to several media outlets, including Forbes, Time Magazine in Europe, ESPN Magazine, and the New York Times. He's an associate professor of economics at Holy Cross, earned his Ph.D. and master's at the University of Minnesota, and his bachelor's from St. Olaf College. Now, I said that Bruce is going to be supporting tonight's proposition, and Victor will be arguing against it. Here's the order that we're going to pursue tonight's events. Each one of our debaters is going to offer a 10-minute, or as long as you can talk, opening statement. Oh, don't say that. Well, I will cut you off at 10 minutes. So that's as long as you'll be able to go. And then after that, rebuttal from each of you. And that'll last for 5 minutes each. And I'll be timing precisely with my device right here. After that point, each of you will have the opportunity to cross-examine the other. And that'll last for 5 minutes each. And then each of you will have the opportunity to rebut. And after that second rebuttal, you'll be able to offer your closing statements. And that'll be for 5 minutes. After that point, we're going to be able to open the questions up among the audience. And we'll take some time to do that. And I believe that Fred or Jason are going to hand me cards with questions that everyone will have written before the fact. So I'll be able to read those off of the paper. And then at that point, after we're finished with audience questions, which will last about 20 minutes, I'll close things up, and then we'll have a close of tonight's event. So, without talking as long as you can, you have 10 minutes, sir, to begin and offer your opening statement on the proposition. And again, I'll remind everyone, the proposition tonight is public subsidies for sports stadiums can generate net regional economic benefits.
Thank you. And in fact, a good way to slightly fine-tune that proposition perhaps is to say that we're really talking here about whether or not one can justify essentially public-private partnership for infrastructure, broadly defined cultural infrastructure. We're talking about sports primarily, but these issues really do run beyond sports. They include, because the methodologies that have been debated really include cultural facilities, parks, even things like development. But we will try to focus on stadiums to keep it more narrow. Many of these stadiums, of course, are not really privately owned. They're actually publicly owned by the cities or essentially development authorities. But there's no question the reason these are controversial is because whenever there's taxpayer money involved that are certainly benefiting privately owned and typically highly profitable organizations, we clearly have an interesting policy question. And it is fraught with abuse. Victor and I agree on many things. We're going to stress our disagreements. One thing we certainly agree on, and I have stressed for many years, is the necessity of more defensively and correctly avoiding the many errors that have been done with what are typically called by economists ex-ante economic impact studies. This is largely related to spending impacts, although I do want to suggest any economist would more broadly define economic impacts to include things that go beyond employment or tax revenue or GDP or personal income effects, to also include things like consumption benefits or the more broadly defined concept of willingness to pay for facilities for the teams that inhabit them in the sports world, which are really subject to what economists often call contingent valuation studies, but we don't want to get into too much technical jargon, but many people understand that term. There's also some longer-term potential effects that are more broadly linked to making communities more attractive in terms of a whole range of quality of life indicators, including cultural facilities, that have longer-term developmental impacts of attracting highly mobile, talented workforces, which are important, and typically are important in any of the empirical work on variations across metro areas and cities. Certainly, investing in human capital is important, and attracting human capital is important. Quality of life is important to that enterprise. Now, there's no doubt there have been many abuses in the ex-ante studies of economic impact, and I've written extensively about how to avoid those, and so Victor and I are in full agreement that we have to do all sorts of adjustments, including making sure that spending that is being generated from people who could easily divert spending to other local activities, so that we're not really adding to the net increase in economic activity, but just diverting it, has to be adjusted for. We have to talk about the capture rates. How much of any new spending that actually comes in is even captured in the very first round by local suppliers and vendors. That's got to be taken into account. There are many abuses of use of multipliers. Multipliers are a legitimate concept. It's not like we have in any way outlawed them through sophisticated analysis. They're legitimate but easily overstated. And in fact, anybody who does this correctly must recognize that depending on the definition of the local region, a smaller region is less economically self-contained, probably does have more net injections into that region of the spending, but it will not circulate as much, and the multipliers will be lower. Conversely, larger areas are less likely to have injections from outside, but will in fact at least have larger multipliers once that exists. Now, there's also segregation problems. There's also divisions about opportunity costs taken into account. I agree with all of that, including capacity constraints. Let me shift to that topic in a sense, because certainly Victor's primary work, and he's done excellent work in this area, is to supplement these ex-ante studies, which again can be done more correctly. And by the way, a quick comment on the ex-ante studies, I want to make sure I get this point across. Theoretically, you can have anything from negative impacts to positive impacts and zero impacts from an ex-ante point of view. It can be done correctly. Now, the key contribution of the ex-post literature, which has primarily been econometric in orientation, although many people perhaps in this audience will understand that I hope we haven't in economics defined empirical work so narrowly as to solely be econometrics. Econometrics is an important issue. But you don't have to be an Austrian economist to at least take some umbrage with the perhaps excessive orientation with econometrics. Austrians think it's all of fraud. I do not. But I'm not an Austrian economist. By the way, there are no Austrian economists left. They're all floating around in some different institutions. The empirical work can be case study oriented. It can be focused on an individual city with a time series, longitudinally. It can be larger databases econometrically. Now, the econometrics literature, of course, has to be looked at very carefully and sometimes skeptically. And it's not just econometricians who have written papers with titles like "Let's take the con out of econometrics," but other sort of methodological philosophers like Peter McCloskey, who have literally, warned us about the excess orientation with statistical significance, which can happen in many situations where there's no economic significance and the like. A key point I want to make about the ex-post econometrics literature. First of all, it is not quite as uniformly negative to the proposition that these public-private partnerships, including tax financing, can pay off. It's a bit more of a mixed bag. And secondly, I think a key thing is to recognize is that even when there are reasonably large absolute dollar impacts by some measure, say regional GDP, these are typically going to be relatively small percentages of the overall regional size of the economy. So when you're talking about the Super Bowl or an annual impact of a sports franchise or mega events like Chick-fil-A bowls or whatever you're hosting in these facilities, they're going to typically be a fraction of 1% of GDP, which means that sometimes it's going to be hard to spot them. Now, one of the problems I've had, I think that makes me skeptical about whether we really learn as much as we think we learned about these so-called negative consequences or non-existent consequences is when we see these results show up as, boy, these are lower than we thought, or maybe they're even negative in some cases, how do we rationalize that? And frequently the rationalization is important to understand. Because anybody who does economics work realizes no data speak for themselves. Even when we've done all the possible tests econometrically and be very careful about it, and Victor's really an expert at this, and I've been very honestly about this, Even when you've done that, you've got to be able to tell a plausible story. Is there a plausible interpretation of why you're getting a result, either positive or negative? Now, one of the main explanations for not getting positive results, and I'll focus on this given my initial time here, it's not just the displacement effect of local spending, displacing of the local spending, or not really accurately identifying money coming in, but this notion that somehow, even if there's new spending coming in, you don't get these big results in the economy because of the crowding out phenomenon. The notion that somehow or other, these visitors are here and they're crowding out other visitors. Or I think one of the most dramatic examples of a study done about construction of stadiums in the St. Louis area where they found no positive employment effects, and their rationalization of this was that, well, apparently, having found this result, apparently what's happened here is this construction project simply meant that anybody who might be working on that project was being taken from some other project. In other words, this project must have crowded out other projects. Now, whenever I tell this to students, just in passing, and say the explanation for this is any one project crowded other projects, I get a rather interesting response. It's kind of a bit of a chuckle. It's almost like, really? This is the explanation? That you can't simultaneously have more than one project? I mean, it's not enough glorious laughter to risk it with, like, maybe you call Roe decide that Hillary's got brain problems or some kind of brain illness. But it's kind of laughter that says you can't really be serious. And those of you who are living here in Atlanta, I can use one of the cheat sheet, only one, to have a list of the important list. Let's just look at what's going on in the construction industry right now in Atlanta in the last year or concurrently. Atlanta, Ponce City Market, College Football Hall of Fame, ongoing Beltline expansion, Atlanta Streetcar Project, the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport Domestic Access Road Development, Hyatt Midtown renovation now complete, 131 North Avenue Housing Development, Emory Crawford Long Proton Therapy Cancer Center, AHA, Atlanta Housing Authority, ongoing mixed income facilities being developed all over the city, Avalon Atlantic Station North, 6th and Jennifer Connor Development Midtown, National Center for Civil and Human Rights Museum, Piedmont Road and Cheshire Bridge Development. I could go on. Now, is it really plausible that every one of these projects is somehow crowded out of the project? It didn't crowd out their projects. You can have these things happening simultaneously, and it's very unlikely, quite frankly, that it's really plausible to think that every time you see a construction project, there should be no impact registered in any kind of national income account or regional income accounts because it's crowded out something else. In fact, here's the implication of this. If you really believe the incremental economic impact and anything tangible, that every one of these projects, if it's all fungible and nothing can happen simultaneously, is zero, let's add up all the zeros. Well, I think advanced mathematics suggests adding a series of zeros is zero. And voila, we have destroyed, we have eliminated the entire construction sector of the economy. GDP, regional income, going to zero. This is implausible. This is, in fact, the reason why I frankly think that some of these econometric results have been oversold. It reminds me of a kind of fallacy. You take a certain element of truth and then expand it beyond the boundaries of what can be sustainable. I was talking to Victor earlier before that I drew an analogy. Every economist would certainly argue that in general, robbing the tax base, reducing tax rates is pretty much a good thing to do in general, and that certainly some kind of tax cutting can generate enough activity to be self-financing. Is it, however, true that economics has quote-unquote proven that all tax cuts generate enough economic activity to be self-financing? Absolutely not. Of course we have. Even the Laffer curve doesn't show that. Even Art Laffer, he shows up on Fox regularly as if he believes this. He can't believe this. His curve doesn't even show that.
Well,
the
on the topic of Art Laffer, let's close the opening statement.
I'll close the opening statement with one final observation. So essentially, any studies when done carefully can generate positive results. Ex post studies are very important, but often generate mixed results, more than you might suspect, and I think are suspect because the explanation of why we're getting these negative or zero results is somewhat flawed. And a final quick comment. Remember, there are other things that go on here in terms of the actual economic benefits, because any of these economic impact studies on studies do not include consumption benefits or the value to people of having access to teams and access to this activity. So they're these sort of more intangible, still to economists, legitimate economic benefits, which must be factored in. I therefore believe, on a case-by-case basis, it simply is not correct to conclude that there's no way that these things can be defensible. And it's not just simply a very small outlier in which they're defensible. It's not maybe the general case, and certainly I'm not defending 100% public financing in any way. It depends case by case how much public financing for the terms.
Yeah. And very briefly, because some people in the audience might not be familiar with the terms ex ante and ex post.
Yes.
You're talking ex ante is before the fact.
That's right.
And ex post is after the fact.
Ex ante always means that based on what we believe is going to happen, of course you can do some adjustive factors without a convention. We'll get into that by just looking at what the attendance happened to be and double check. Right. But ex post then tries to say, given the data that we now have some access to after the fact, can we find what you might say the tracks of the sand, right? What we predicted in advance.
Right.
That's correct. Sorry.
Well, if you need an extra minute, I'll be happy to give you that extra minute. Professor Matheson, what is your opening statement on the resolution?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here in Atlanta. And so over the last about 25 years, we've embarked on a huge amount of infrastructure construction dedicated towards building stadiums and arenas for our, I would say, 5 major sports leagues in the United States: the NHL, Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, and Major League Soccer that's come on the scene here over the last 25 years. And over that time period, we've spent about $30 billion building these stadiums. $20 billion of that has come out of taxpayer pockets. The real question we need to ask ourselves is that $20 billion that's been spent by taxpayers, was that a wise use of taxpayer funding? Well, anytime we spend a bunch of money, we expect to get something out of it. But the question is, how much are we getting out of that public money that we're putting in there, and could that money have been directed somewhere better? Well, certainly the proponents of putting a bunch of money into these stadiums will very commonly say, well, of course, just look at any city on a night they're hosting an NFL game or a Major League Baseball game. Go over to Turner Field on a day when they are hosting a rival. They're hosting the Dodgers in town, and you'll see 35,000 people pouring out of that stadium. Their wallets will be open. They're buying hot dogs. They're buying beer. They're buying the mandated peanuts and popcorn and Cracker Jack because it's on television. So, how can that not be a huge economic impact on the local economy when we directly see thousands of people opening up their wallets and spending a lot of money? Well, economists like me will say, well, there's 3 things going on here. Number one, there's a substitution effect. And what's happening here is a local person from the Atlanta area who goes to a baseball game is spending money at Turner Field. And it's certainly easy to count that as economic activity that's occurring, but to count every dollar that is spent there as economic impact would presume that if the game was not there, that person would have stayed at home with the lights out, the television off, and fasting. And that money would not have been spent anywhere else in the local economy. I, as an economist, and many other economists I know disagrees with this, certainly realizes that a large amount of that spending that is going on in the Falcon Stadium in Georgia Dome, in Turner Field, is spending, if those activities weren't there, would have been spent elsewhere in the local economy. Of course, not everyone who is at the game at any given time is from the local Atlanta area, so certainly we might have people coming in from out of town who are coming and spending money there. Certainly that might be an injection of money into the economy. But even there, we might not be counting every dollar. So, for example, next month I'm going to be in Denver. While I'm in Denver, I'm going to go to see actually the Colorado Rapids of Major League Soccer. But the only reason I'm going there while I'm there is not the reason I was going. It's just one of the things that I happen to do when I'm there. So again, had I not been going to the soccer game, I would have been spending money elsewhere in the local economy, and I might have been spending money at a place that actually would have stuck in the local economy much better. The third thing that happens, and that's what we call the crowding out effect, and there's a question about how much crowding out there is going on there. Another example that can happen is, let's imagine we have a Super Bowl in town. We just had one in New York and New Jersey here earlier. Now let's imagine that we have every hotel room in New York City full, and they're all full of sports fans. But if those hotels would have normally been 80% full anyway, there's the tendency to count every sports fan as economic impact to the city, when in fact you have those hotel rooms would have been full of regular visitors anyway, and really we should only maybe count that little amount on the margin. We can also have crowds and congestion associated with sporting events that detract other people from going down into the region where an event is going on. As a matter of fact, famous baseball player Yogi Berra, he always used to say, you know, no one goes there anymore, it's too crowded. That's obviously a little goofy, but you have to understand that crowds and congestion can actually dissuade other additional activities from going on there. Third thing that we're concerned about is leakages, and that's, we certainly know that when money is spent in the local economy, that it's likely to be spent and respent. But the question is, how much of money that gets spent at a local baseball game or football game actually sticks in the local economy? If you're spending money at a locally owned restaurant, 95% of those workers typically are going to be people who live in the local metropolitan area where that restaurant is located. At least that's what a typical worker is in the United States. However, very few professional baseball players or professional football players actually live full-time year-round in the city in which they play, which means that about half of the money the locals spend on football games, on baseball games, on basketball games, about half of that money goes into the players' pockets and immediately leaves the area with those players when they live elsewhere in the off-season. So for all those reasons, we might expect the total amount of money being spent on sports actually might not be increasing your economy very much. So, with that being said, you got to say, all right, well, so how are we going to test this? And what's happened over about the last 25 years is economists not associated with the leagues or local chambers of commerce or other places, they will come in, they have, and I'm one of these, has come in and we try to take a look at any economic variable that we can get our hands on. We try to look at things like GDP, like personal income, like taxable sales, like employment or unemployment, like hotel occupancy, like visitor arrivals. And we try to see whether the presence of mega events, whether the presence of new stadiums, whether the presence of franchises actually causes a discernible bump in the amount of economic activity we see. And by and large, these studies find that the economic impact associated with sporting events is either zero or very small, or not discernibly different than zero. As a rule of thumb, economists like me would say this. Take whatever the supporters are telling you, move the decimal point one place to the left, and that's a pretty good estimate. Now, mind you, that means that we're not getting all the way down to zero. So I would have to say that maybe I'm going to lose this debate because I'm not going to argue that you have zero economic impact from these events. However, I will argue that the economic impact of these events is a fraction of what's claimed. And if the economic impact is a fraction of what is claimed, then the amount of public subsidy that's justified putting into facilities like this is probably a fraction of what's typically being asked.
You have another couple of minutes if you'd like to take them.
Okay, so we can talk about all sorts of fun stuff. Right? I'm an economist and I'm a professor. I will never turn down extra time here. Let's talk about a couple of things interestingly in Atlanta, right? So obviously, we have several interesting impacts, or several interesting stories in Atlanta. Number one, you have lost your NHL franchise for the second time in the past 30 years to a Canadian city. You lost the Atlanta Flames to Calgary back in 1980 or so, and you just lost the Thrashers to Winnipeg. What we should see, if the studies about economic impact are true, what we should see is a huge hit on the local economy. Instead, what we're seeing is almost no discernible impact. That these sort of things don't even register in the data as a drop-off from these sort of events. We also have two new stadiums being planned, one for the Falcons, one for the Braves. It should be noted that the Atlanta Braves Stadium was built as part of the preparation for the Olympics back in 1996, which means that this stadium that is being abandoned is a stadium that is actually the same age as Miley Cyrus. Yet, somehow the stadium is no longer economically viable. This is a stadium that's only about 20 years old. I have t-shirts in my drawer at home that are 20 years old. Yet you can't build a stadium that lasts for 20 years. There's no doubt that this is a stadium that's not physically obsolete in any way, but it's economically obsolete to a Braves owner who wants to make a lot more money on it. One of the reasons that the Braves owner wants to move the team into the Northwest suburbs is because he says, look, you know, this stadium is in a terrible neighborhood. No one wants to come down to this neighborhood and go to a game here. But simultaneously, he's saying, well, let's move it up in the Northwest, and what's going to happen when we build a stadium there is it's going to have all sorts of great neighborhood impact. That's an odd thing to be saying, considering that the stadium has been in 18 years in the location it has, and it has done almost nothing to improve the local neighborhood there. And the justification for leaving is the stadium hasn't had any local neighborhood effects, but the justification to go in here is because of the big neighborhood effects we're going to have when we move the stadium there. So. Let's end it there so we can have a little more back and forth and talk about it. So we'll go to your rebuttal.
Sure. Three quick points. First of all, Victor's delineation of the corrections that must be made in extended studies is absolutely correct. I've continually made them, whether it's making sure that the local capture rates are hardly 100%, because there's no question, there's no multiplier effect. There's not even a first-round capture in the local economy. And the example he gives about local people spending money to go to athletes who don't live locally is a very good example, and certainly one reason why the economic impact of sports franchise is often quite low. It may not be zero, but certainly lower than many of the other things like mega events or even the construction phase. That's correct. Certainly, displacement effect is very important. Now, the crowd announcing, again, I always make these adjustments, and you also use some ex post analysis to check this out. I did a study of the 2000 Super Bowl here in Atlanta. I happen to be aware that there was also doing some work through the World Congress Center that during that month of January, they actually had slightly higher activity at the convention center than they had before. I also continually check with the Atlanta Convention and Visitors Bureau regarding occupancy rates for hotels. First of all, they're never 100%. They're never fully booked, and so there's always some excess capacity. Philip Porter, an economist, told us now that actually claims that the Super Bowls have zero economic impact. Actually examined this over entirely too short a window, like 2.5 days. Well, activity goes on much longer in preparation, and some of these effects that do have indirect effects go a little bit longer as well. So I think some of these things are overstated, and even some ex post analysis as well as the ex-ante corrections. But everybody agrees that we make, and there's no doubt if we don't make those corrections, we will blow the numbers up in an indefensible way. Absolutely. I think you also made two very important points I want to address them quickly. There's no doubt that you have to also look at, if there's tax money involved, exactly, what's the downside of that? Because tax money then will perhaps take some other activity out of the economy, absolutely. You must look case by case at exactly what the taxing happens to be. As an example, if there's hotel, motel tax revenues, well, certainly some of that is going to be paid by local people. A lot of that is export. You can debate what magnitude it is, but if there's no excise tax increases, no property tax increases, that might not be as big a problem as you might think. And remember also, you have 30 years, let's say, of a facility, and they generate impacts on the team, even if modest, from many events that they can host that may not have otherwise occurred. It's over a 30-year period. The public financing typically supports bonds, so you don't have automatically upfront spending over a period of time as well. So if you look at risk present value calculations, you can always often find, at least not in a single case, but in enough cases, causative effects. The other point I want to quickly address is this issue about opportunity cost. If any economist tells you opportunity costs are not important, their Ph.D. should be removed. So I will agree they should be. But this is an interesting issue. If you sit there, I'm going to guess, any of you with either spouse or significant others, probably when you decided to commit, at least temporarily, to that, probably did not line up the top 20 candidates and do a cost-benefit ratio analysis to decide who to commit to. In fact, the famous commitment phobia in economics terms is simply exhaustively taking into account opportunity costs. So you can always say, well, the money could have been spent better elsewhere. Frequently what you're confronting, even though it's totally legitimate to make this question, raise this point, you're confronting money coming in, Private developers are coming in, often the public money is seed money, it generates other private money, and you're sitting there saying, well, time is of the essence, we've got to commit to this, not commit to this. You often don't have the luxury of saying, we're going to put into a 5-year plan to figure out ranking these projects. I am sensitive to that. I do understand that's an important point. But in reality, frequently, it almost is a formula for paralysis. Now, there's no doubt the burden of proof has to be on anyone claiming that public tax financing should be involved at all. I don't disagree with that. The burden should be on them. And I can't imagine circumstances in which I would support 100% public financing. Again, remember, as I said at the beginning, many of these facilities end up actually being owned by the public sector. Frankly, going beyond the usual scope of this, I'm not even opposed to allowing cities to have equity stakes in the team, even at some point. But that's not something that's feasible under the typical professional league operating rules. But I wouldn't totally oppose that. And at least when you own the facility, you get some rent money back, as in the case of Turner Field, the city's able to sell that. There's an interesting alternative with a university who the state buys it or somebody else buys it. You're going to have some benefits back to the city. So again, I think that what Victor is saying is, in fact, I agree with almost everything Victor said. I think it's just the implications of it. I don't believe that the ex post studies uniformly show that there's zero effects. He's conceded that. I don't want to be unfair to the con arguments, however. If it's simply a matter of saying, oh, these are positive but very trivially small, and they can't possibly justify this, I would not understand that. I mean, the pro side should not win on a technicality. I would not feel satisfied about that. I'm not even sure I want the pro side to win. That's why I also understand the con side. I don't think I understand the pro side. Well, I think I need to be reasonable about this stuff. If you were opposed to private-public involvement, you'd have to oppose to the Beltline, the aquarium. I mean, just think of the implications of this. It goes beyond, I think, but I would feel comfortable in the documentary statement that some of this is ongoing. Yes. Victor.
So, let me say only a little, so let's make this a little bit of a bit more, but I clearly disagree with Bruce on that one, is this concept of motel and hotel tax. I think Bruce is absolutely right that, it's very common for politicians to say, hey, let's finance our stadium through rental car taxes, because other people are paying that. Let's finance it on hotels with taxes. That's a professor coming in from Boston to give a debate, paying a bunch of that, so you don't have to worry about that. Let's figure out things that other people are paying for to pay for a stadium, and then it's like, well, we get a stadium for free. I think the real problem from my side is that you could always use hotel taxes to pay your teachers, your firefighters, and your police officers. You can build your local roads with hotel taxes. So this idea that you must put hotel taxes towards the stadium, I think is the wrong one. So we give at least one truth that's not here. It is certainly true that we do have a small handful of success stories in stadiums. I would say that I'm comfortable taking a no sports subsidy standpoint because the number of examples of bad things happening so widely exceeds the number of things where we have some clear good outcomes that I think it's a fairly safe bet if I was betting in on this. For example, we saw just in January, we saw Russia build we saw Russia spend $51 billion hosting Winter Olympics. To pay back $51 billion and develop general infrastructure, to pay back $51 billion, Russia, Sochi, would have to generate the same amount of tourist revenue as Disney World, and Disneyland, and Disney Tokyo, and Disney Paris, and Disney Cruise Lines, and Disney China, and the other Disney China and Hong Kong, and then you need 50% more on top of that. This sort of thing is happening, but maybe it's key. So they would just have to generate as much money, enough tourist revenue as Vail, Colorado, and Breckenridge, and Keystone, and 90 other ski resorts. That's almost certainly not happening. We see things being designed to try to promote tourism. The London Olympics, fantastic Olympics. Everyone loves seeing the Queen being saved by James Bond during the opening ceremony. That was fun. Certainly that had to have been great for London. Well, actually, total number of tourist arrivals was down for the UK over that time period. We see it again time after time after time, and in some ways it's not a surprise. Remember, sports teams are not in the business of local economic development. They're in the business of generating as much revenue as possible. The way you generate revenue is not by creating a neighborhood full of bars and restaurants that people can go to before and after the game. The way you make money is to make sure anyone who gets to your stadium is spending all that money inside. And so far too often we have sports projects where you have a walled fortress surrounded by an entire moat of parking lots, driving all of the economic activity in and keeping all of those raging hordes out.
On the raging horse topic, anything you would like to add?
Shockingly, I did. It's a quick response, actually. Should I pose a question? Or
Please, yeah, we can
Well,
have a little bit of a free
quick response.
response.
I mean, I'm not going to defend, the oligarchical corruption of current Russia.
At least Russia got a lot of goodwill out of that. I mean, for 3 days until they invaded Ukraine. But go ahead.
It's interesting. The Olympics, of course, and I totally agree that the impact claims about the Olympics have typically been overstated. But it's interesting. There have been ex post studies done with quite mixed results. One of them was done, actually the same paper actually was published, found that the Olympics in 1998 had almost no beneficial effects that were actually measurable, but the one in Germany, so the French ones, but the German ones had 700,000 additional hotel nights and something, 1 billion. I mean, the Germans did the study. They were from the university. Maybe they were just trying to back the French somewhere. I don't know, but it's interesting that sort of result happened. It can be somewhat different in terms of at least finding some positive effects. Another thing that's interesting about this is frequently the effects that are really dramatic and very beneficial are within a region. I wrote about this with the Atlanta case. A lot of what happens is intra-regional. Even within London, arguably some very beneficial effects within the city. In Atlanta, the amount of investment that relocated from the already fairly thriving suburban areas into the city was rather dramatic. And anyone who knows Atlanta knows this is true. Just to get an idea of how tricky this question is and how unresolved it really is, Mark Rosentraut was somebody that obviously Victor knows as well. In 1998, wrote a book called, roughly speaking, The Losers from Public Support.
Major League Losers.
Major League Losers. But what did he write 10 years later? Major League Winners. Major League Winners. And identified among his prime examples using case studies as the empirical analysis, Indianapolis, LA, Cleveland, Columbus, even Reading, Pennsylvania, which I my family always established there, and it is a dismal downtown, but less dismal now because of some of these investments. In other words, you can find some of these examples. Now, again, I think it's important data. At one final point, when Victor says we don't see in London tourism increasing over that time period, again, and Victor and I discussed this, and it's something well known within the economic profession. There's a big debate about this regarding how to capture what you might call time-shifted effects. Now, Victor gave a very good example, or I think hinted at an example of how time-shifting might reduce the expanding impacts and also the exposure. If somebody was, let's say, already planning to go to Atlanta, let's say, but there's going to be, say, a Chick-fil-A bowl, and they decide, well, I'll go with them because I have something else to do. That's not going to be a net injection, even if it's somebody in from the outside. But there's other time shifting. If you know that the Olympics are going to be a time where hotels are going to be more crowded than usual, and there's going to be a bump up in the rates. I mean, if you want to go to London, you'll say, look, I'm going to avoid London at that point. So if you just look at it over a narrow time period, you're going to miss this time-shifting phenomenon. So in that sense, looking at annual data might be better. And by the way, in all fairness, ex post studies, which Victor has contributed to so brilliantly in many cases, and so honestly. I mean, I have a question I'm going to ask him later about one of his recent contributions on this topic. But it is, in general, you have to look at this time period thing. It's sometimes annual, it's sometimes very brief periods, quarterly, monthly, almost daily. And I think the time period matters, and the region, the definition of a region matters. And there's not a lot of data on cities, so say Atlanta versus Metro, or Boston versus Metro. And let's face it, I mean, I can tell you right now, something that was publicly discussed in the Braves reporter interviewed me about this result. For the city of Atlanta and the Atlanta Braves, 73% of the tickets sold were from non-Atlanta. And about 83% of its gross revenues from all sources, including media, were from outside the city. Now, not all of that stayed captured, that's correct. When I did that analysis, and you had a positive, the Thrasher case we reported didn't have a positive effect. Although you might have done the city versus the metro, but that would have been more modest. But for each, even if I have 110 million of an effect per year, even which is already going to be very conservatively done, that can justify a certain amount of public sector investment, even when you take into account all these kind of adjustments.
Bruce, you've got about a minute left. Do you want to have the opportunity to ask him a question before everyone else?
Yeah, and I kind of gave Victor a little bit of heads up on this, but I think it's a very useful point. Victor co-authored a paper recently, which I found very intriguing, and it's far too technical to step itself, but if he goes into some of the weaknesses of the econometrics, he set up an interesting example whereby certain kinds of events in collegiate sports that are very minor sports that really are not going to have much of an impact, okay? And he examines through initially using some sort of non-sophisticated econometric techniques to show that even when you don't expect a priori any feasible transmission mechanism of a tangible, measurable impact, you can sometimes get those results. Well, we all know this in econometrics. You can get correlation without causation. I mean, people have argued that large enough database, enough sample observations, you can get statistical significance out of almost anything, okay? So he then says, quite correctly, if we have a result that shows there is an impact, but we have no belief in advance that there could possibly be this impact, where are we going wrong in the econometrics? So I asked a very friendly professional question. Think of the converse case. Take a case in which people like me have done, and I'm not alone in this, but I've certainly been also looking at this, have done a really diligent job on the ex-ante analysis. There's a plausible transmission mechanism. We've got this data. And by the way, even in terms of the brain, there's actually more people that actually live in the brain. In fact, Atlanta is one of those barometric areas which does have quite a few professional athletes living here. It actually is a little bit of an outlier right now, but let's say you have a case in which there's every reason to believe that there'll be some kind of an impact. And of course, Victor's been good enough and honest enough to say he's not really arguing zero, but there's an impact, but the data's not showing. Ex-post are not showing. It would seem to me, and he's I know trying to do this, that you would naturally then ask yourself, well, if it's a plausible mechanism that there should be an impact and we're not finding it, maybe it's just that econometrics can't find it. And again, I mentioned, even absolute dollars that are fairly large are going to be a relatively small share of the economy. This is really hard to find through the typical wiles of econometrics, no matter how sophisticated, and Victor's a terrific job on the econometrics in doing it. So I think that's the issue.
Let's let him respond to that. Actually, we're going to open up the cross-examination, so if you want to respond to that quickly and then ask a question of Bruce, we'll have another 5 minutes. So
Bruce makes a good point here. Remember, let's imagine we bring a Super Bowl here against Atlanta, and we're planning a $500 million economic impact. The total equity economy of the greater Atlanta area is well in excess of $500 billion. So this is looking for 1/10 of 1%. So this is going to be hard to do. How do you find that needle in a haystack? Well, one thing you do is you try to make the needle as big as possible, and you try to make the haystack as small as possible, while being careful not to make the haystack too small. So there's some good points there, and I would say the econometric work that I am most proud of is the work that I have done that has actually found an economic impact, but also found an economic impact at the fraction rate. One example, very quickly, looking at employment around Salt Lake City during 2002 when they were having the Winter Olympics. That was about a $2 billion investment, much of which was public money. And they claimed, the host committee claimed that it was going to generate 35,000 new jobs. We looked at the data, and in fact, we did find that statistically significant all these things. We found actually that we did create jobs in Salt Lake City, about 7,000. Now again, 7,000 jobs is nothing to sneeze at, but it's also, again, 1/5 of what was claimed before. I think that's the most credible sort of thing, because it shows that we are finding an actual bump, but we are also finding a bump that is a fraction of all of this claim.
Do you have a question you'd like to ask him?
So I'll set you up with a good question. Let's move into talking about
that $25 that kind of spurt.
Let's talk about some of the non-economic benefits of sports, and is that worth, do you think the non-economic benefits of sports are worth any sort of significant public subsidy? And there's lots of non-economic benefits associated with shopping. People like to shop, but we don't subsidize, movies. People want to go to movies, but we don't subsidize movie theaters. So is there something special about sports that we think we should subsidize?
Yeah, and I'll mention we have 1 minute for the response.
Okay, one of your co-authors, somebody I know as well, Rob Body, asked a question in one of your papers, what is unique about sports? He basically said, not just sports, but almost any enterprise won't show them the data. But is there something special about sports? Actually, I think there is something special about sports. In South Africa, when they had the rugby tournament that led to this incredible championship, the De Beers company probably had a bigger economic impact in a more measurable way on South Africa. Corrupt as De Beers has always been, it was an alcohol operation. But that transformed the country at a very delicate time for South Africa. Almost everybody understands what it's like to be in a city which is somewhat unified and it's all the discord by their teams doing better. Good Lord, even when the Cubbies occasionally win a game, it's like euphoria on the north side of Chicago. Except for the Outlands list. But in general, there are these benefits. I think that they are, to an economist, legitimate and, in fact, can sometimes be measured. There's a recent paper, actually, in the Socioeconomics Review, something like a journal, about the contingent valuation, willingness to pay measure, keeping the Vikings in Minnesota. And interestingly enough, it was a pretty large number, although it was an interesting example of sort of one of the abuses of sports, which is the threat to take the Vikings out of Minnesota. But because that was a credible threat at the time, the issue was much more real to the people who were being investigated. What would they pay per household to keep the Vikings in Minnesota? And it was something like, on average, was it like $1,500 or something? I mean, it was something, again, some households zero, some enormous amounts. Maybe it was actually 161. It was something that multiplied by the household was a fairly large number. By the way, full disclosure, that was a very controversial public financing issue about the stadium. And when they isolated the separate contingent valuation was to pay for the public financing of the stadium, it was negative and drew down the overall value. But Victor's question is, should we factor in something unique about what sports creates in consumption values? Well, I don't disagree that, frankly, to an economist, anything, buying a stick of gum has consumer surplus. You almost never, sellers want to capture every bit of consumer surplus, which is the extra amount you would be willing to pay but don't have to. They can't totally take everything that you will. So it's not unique, but sports does have some unique features to it that I think the arts as well have an element about this that should not be ignored, even though I would not disagree with the general question about doing some comparisons across other possible candidates for support. I would agree with that.
So there was a question that was just brought up in what Bruce was talking about, and I might just sort of have you lead off with that in your rebuttal. How strong is the economic impact of different sports teams competing to have different host cities? Like, if you're asking the Thrashers to move, is that a significant reason why subsidies should be offered? Does that happen often?
Well, so there's the real key here is the NFL did one of the smartest things from an economist standpoint that anyone can think of in recent memory. They did this 20 years ago. They abandoned Los Angeles. That normally would be a crazy notion, right? You're leaving the second largest media market in the United States, open and no NFL franchise there. How could you possibly do that? Well, it's turned out fantastic for the NFL because city after city after city has been able to use the threat of moving to Los Angeles to extract money out of taxpayers to build new stadiums. And it turns out that it's been a stroke of genius. I don't think they did it on purpose. Sometimes you're an accidental genius. And I think they turned it to accidental geniuses here. And again, credible threat after credible threat. There is much less credible threat for baseball teams to move, or hockey teams to move in general. There's just simply not as many places clamoring for hockey, and certainly not baseball. It is a very hard case here in Atlanta because Major League Baseball is not abandoning the Atlanta area. I don't think you can really count the let's not lose a franchise when you're talking about baseball in Atlanta. Because baseball, there is not a more profitable open market anywhere in the country for baseball, which means that we're not going anywhere. The only way that Major League Baseball is going to be able to extract money out of taxpayers, or is going to be able to successfully do that, they can't play city versus city against this, or metropolitan area versus metropolitan area. They're going to have to pit individual cities within the metropolitan area against one another, and I think that's what they successfully done here.
Yeah, baseball is an interesting case because it's bizarre as this antitrust exemption is in baseball, and justified, no doubt. And antitrust is unique in sports because you have to both cooperate and compete, so there's always an issue with antitrust. But interestingly enough, the reason why you don't have the famous Baltimore Colts packing up in the middle of the night to Indianapolis, or Al Davis moving the Raiders up and down the West Coast, is because in baseball, it is much harder to move teams because the owners literally can almost veto any movement, so it's extremely tough. Whereas in football, for example, the owners have more independence to do that. You might say if you're a defender of private property rights, you should have the option of moving. Obviously, leagues, by almost definition, are a bit of a cartel, and the limits have to be because you have an issue about, the quality of the product. If you simply had every single, community having a team, you'd have all sorts of limitations on the quality of the play and the athleticism, whatever. So some limitations are necessary, but it's an ironic issue that baseball actually has almost taken one of its weapons to hold hostage local politicians by making moving more difficult in baseball than it is in these other sports, because it's very hard. And even when there's a team that's going to definitely lead, like when the Expos left Montreal, look at the battle that broke out to move them to Washington because Baltimore claimed that this was going to be in our territory. That was a huge battle to have them move in there. And the only reason the Braves get to move it is the Braves so often say, hey, we're moving 10 miles away, we're going to still be called Atlanta. If they left this market, you would see a huge battle, and in fact, that would have been a totally different story. So, that's our implication about it. And by the way, I'm not a big fan of this whole agnostic thing. I'll say one thing about Arthur Blank and the South. It was never, you can say when it was implicit, but it was almost never a credible argument who's ever going to make about leaving Atlanta. Like even leaving the city. He's a city guy. Tim of the Ted Turner's a city guy. And the Braves only are leaving the city of Atlanta because it's this media conglomerate out in the middle of nowhere. Kind of doesn't quite frankly give a damn about what's going on within the metro area, pro or con about where they live. Ted wouldn't have moved them. Arthur wasn't going to move them. And I'm not at all a fan of owners holding that kind of threat over a local political figure that I think is abused, which I would support. But that's a reality. Yes.
Right. Well, we have a lot of really good questions that have been answered here. So I would like to change the schedule a little bit, move up the closing statements if you'd like to make those, and then we can move right into questions. So, Victor, would you like to make your closing statement?
Yeah, so I'm going to just keep this quick so we can answer a bunch of questions if you want. My research into the direct economic impact of, again, franchise stadiums and mega events suggests that the economic impact of sports tends to be small, tends to be a fraction of what is typically claimed. That being said, we do have some evidence that sports make us happy. The World Cup in Germany that was alluded to in 2006, we had evidence there that small positive economic impact in terms of visitor days and tourist spending, but really very small. But what we did see very significantly is that the self-reported happiness of Germans was much higher after the event than before the event. And I think we have some good history that suggests that the world's a better place with a lot of happy Germans than a lot of angry Germans. So, we do have some evidence that sports makes us happy, but we don't have much evidence that it makes us rich.
I'll be brief as well, because I think the question is going to be fun. I haven't been in Germany during that time, and one thing that I happened to notice in the footnote to that was utterly remarkable, because I travel quite a bit, I've been to Germany quite often. The first time I had ever seen German flags flying anywhere was certainly the first time. And for understandable reasons, that whole kind of patriotic fervor had been totally out in the house for Germany, not absent during the Olympics. Now, my other simple point is this. Again, Victor and I agree on a lot. I think it's a matter of emphasis. My position is that there has been no argument persuasively made by economists or the ex post literature and econometrics that somehow proves that public-private partnerships to create cultural infrastructure and stadiums, which, by the way, are often actually owned by those public entities, not owned by the private team, that particular proposition has to be a loser or a bit of stupidity. Is it abused? Absolutely. Have there been horrible deals cut? Absolutely. There's no question about that. I think if you do some of the present value calculations, it depends a lot on the nature of the deal, which of course makes it a less interesting point, because we like bumper sticker points, but oftentimes the bumper sticker points aren't the most accurate points. And I think it's a matter of really looking at it case by case. What I would hope that this audience would at least reflect upon, because I suspect that, and understandably, that your prior idea about this would be generally hostile to the notion of using any public finances for these projects, and I understand that general hostility. And like I said, the burden of proof, I think, should absolutely be on private entities who are tapping into that public purse. But when you look at this as investment, when you look at the fact that the arguments that are being made here are really part of a broader issue that we here in Atlanta understand to be whether or not there's a role for public sector financing for projects that can range from aquariums to belt lines and park projects to streetcar projects. Yes, absolutely. Ex-ante studies must be done carefully. I know when I did the ex-post studies sometimes outside of the econometrics realm can sometimes actually surprise us on the upside. The aquarium, all of you I think are aware of this, the actual projection for the aquarium for the first year, the attendance was like 58% higher. It was off the chart. It was astonishing how much more. But however, interestingly enough, when I did the ex-post study of that, not econometrically, you had also adjusted. We also found out after the fact. There were many more day trippers than were hoped to be the case, many fewer hotel nights, and many people staying with friends. And so even though the attendance was absolutely off the chart, and to this day, even before the dolphin exhibit expanded, which kept that attendance higher, they're still, even before that happened, they were still higher than what their projection was. They were, as always happens with current, you start out high and you go lower, okay? But their lower projections are still higher than the lower projections. Again, the ex-post stuff in the Olympics, I had colleagues at Georgia State who actually found some more permanent, well, not permanent effects, but reasonably significant effects. You found them in Salt Lake City. Two of my colleagues, one of them was a co-author of mine on some other projects, actually found some evidence in Atlanta about some employment effects that were really kind of interesting, and very sound econometrics applied there as well. So I just think I want you to have an open mind about this. I think we all agree, certainly Victor and I agree, that the potential for abuse here is very serious. But if you don't want to take a kind of principled, almost ideological position that basically says that this is somehow a totally inappropriate role for the public sector to play, especially in a kind of public-private alliance, where, in fact, the Rosentraum literature plays on the very important theme that if the public sector money can be used as seed money for further private sector investment, especially when you talk about some of the inner-city things. Yes, Atlanta has not been a good example of immediate neighborhood effects, but remember, these economic impacts are not only in the immediate neighborhood. And I would just say that I know both the Braves and the Falcons are certainly making serious efforts to have whatever neighborhood effect around the stadium being a very different story. Has the general story been a bad one on the immediate neighborhood? Absolutely, because there's been far too many stadiums built surrounded by acres of concrete. Whoever thought that would be a good idea for the neighborhood? That's preposterous. Of course, what's happened at Turner Field, we were discussing it before the event, was partly, let's face it, it was partly the highways. I mean, look, how many cities have had neighborhoods destroyed by highways? I mean, there's been more neighborhood destruction by highways than almost any single factor in America, and everybody knows that. And so Turner Field, to some extent, and Fulton County Stadium before, it was almost doomed because it was already cut off. I mean, in terms of like making Summerhill a vibrant community, that was going to be a long shot proposition for many reasons. It depends on whether that's going to be a sports field. Certainly, I think if Georgia State gets it, it'll be a different story. By the way, I would just make an interesting observation because I happen to know a group that's very actively involved in this. You'll laugh at this, but I was telling Victor earlier. It's some very serious work done. And even Maria supporters picked up on this in the Atlanta Business Chronicle, exploring the possibility of using Turner Field to host an expansion American League franchise called the Atlanta Surge. Now that's floating around. There's been serious meetings about it. I don't think it's a likely case, and you can have all these fun ideas. You can plan to support a second team. By the way, interestingly enough, on that question, I think if you ask the ownership of the Baltimore Orioles today whether they really, in retrospect, should have been opposed to the Washington Nationals, they're going to say, no, we were too short-sighted. That was not a disaster for the Baltimore Orioles. It made that actually a very interesting rivalry there. And if anything, I think created in that area a much more vibrant kind of scene overall, for the overall cultural infrastructure part defined and the entertainment sector more narrowly.
I'll ask a quick question. Doesn't your institution have a bid in for Turner Field for repurposing?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the most credible bids, one that the mayor supports, is in fact the Georgia State to continue. It was already, I think, the savior of the central business district. Because we could deny that. We finally have, after how many decades of hoping to have a little bit of, even cafes staying up and past 3:30 in the afternoon. This is happening, folks, and it's partly because of the housing. But I think it's very exciting that the Georgia State University proposal is out there. I think the drawings are interesting. It's got mixed-use facilities, student housing, turning Turner Field into a combination soccer facility and football facility for the Georgia State team, and also, interestingly enough, creating a baseball stadium on the footprint of the old Atlanta Fulton County Stadium using the Hank Aaron wall as a key feature of it. It's, I think, a brilliant proposal. And this is the mayor's goal, as many of you are aware, of also having additional housing for Summerhill, because this is going to be a mixed-use facility with additional park space, housing for the community, as well as student housing. Student housing means people around the clock, and good Lord, can we actually finally get a downtown growth facility possible?
Well, excellent. We'll move into questions. And we've got a lot of good ones here. The first one, I believe, is aimed toward Professor Matheson, and it kind of goes to Professor Seaman's opportunity cost argument that he brought in earlier. The question reads, should jobs created enabled by subsidy funding be considered as jobs taken away from free market winners?
I'm not sure I want to go so far as to say that. I would, however, say, look, any jobs that are created by a state, those are real jobs. I think police officers, I think firefighters, I think school teachers, all of whom are paid out of taxpayer money. I think these are all real jobs. I am very happy for my public servants in my community, in my state, in my country. That being said, we certainly need to weigh if we are creating a handful of new jobs, and again, the full-time equivalent year-round job at a sports facility is not much higher than the number of full-time year-round jobs at a large department store like Macy's. That being said, if we're counting these jobs as jobs being created, the additional taxes that have had to be raised, and we know that taxes do reduce jobs, those need to be weighed and balanced out. So I'll leave it with that.
And then I've got a question. If professional sports stadiums should be taxpayer financed, why not university or amateur sports venues?
Well, I think. Yeah. Look, I mean, first of all, again, taxpayer finance is a relative term. I mean, you've got situations in which you have 20% of it coming from essentially the sale of bonds backed by a certain kind of tax basis. I don't disagree with some of the comments made by Victor Miller of the hotel tax. And I wouldn't want to pull a footnote point about the fact that the state has authorized the uses of hotel tax. That could be that's been an argument that's been used, obviously, that's already earmarked in certain ways, and unless we change that legislation, there's not an issue of redirecting it somewhere else. But I don't disagree with the general point. In general here, we're talking about taxpayer finance. I mean, yes, there have been some states that have been literally 100% financed by the public sector. I find it very hard to imagine a case in which I could find that to be a supportable proposition. I have to say, again, I've argued for case-by-case analysis, so I can't totally say it's impossible, but I would say very, very unlikely I could find that at a comfort level. Now, of course, when it comes to, obviously, universities, we obviously already have public universities where tax finance is a large part. and private sector universities that at least get special tax treatment as nonprofit organizations. So, I mean, we already have to some extent a form of this kind of public financing going on. And again, I think we just have to ask the question, unless you want to take a principled position against certain roles of the state in general, the general proposition, you should look at these things in terms of what their potential payoff is. I think it's true, intercollegiate athletics gets oversold in many respects. And we can debate been going on for a long time. But let's face it, I mean, I know in Georgia State's case, trying to, expanding intercollegiate football was almost a desperation move, given that we live in a state which has political figures who, in part, are influenced by the visibility, not just academically, which I think Georgia State's been doing great with, frankly, but it also requires some visibility elsewhere. And look, it does create a climate for universities for student life that has been disappointing so far as attendance, and of course they keep moving to higher levels of competition. But I think in general, the notion that there should be some case made for public sector investment, I think it's already been happening randomly. And so again, within the limits of my general observation of vigilance being absolutely critical, and the potential for abuse and corruption always being present, and misuse of funds. I mean, I'm totally aware of that. I'll work to that. I don't see a big problem with the general proposition that they're going to make a case made for some public funding on both of them.
So the answer is provisionally, but on a case by case basis.
Yes. Thank you. Why did I say that? Was that summary comment?
Now, I've got an interesting question here, and this kind of is a little bit off topic, but I'm really curious to hear from either of you or both of you about this. The question reads, could you talk about the economics of an arrangement such as that at the Green Bay Packers, where the public there owns part of the team?
I think the great thing about the arrangement in the Green Bay Packers is about, so just to fill you very briefly, the arrangement in Green Bay is that team is owned by the residents of the city. We actually see this fairly commonly in Europe. For example, Real Madrid, maybe the greatest soccer team in Europe, is owned by the season ticket holders. It's a club-owned team. There's not an owner of that team. It's owned by the fans. And of course, what you want as a fan is you are not trying to make money off of this. You're just trying to support a team. And so your season ticket, your club membership is the season tickets and the right to vote on club management. The great thing about citizen management and citizen ownership is it takes away the blackmail threat. That's I think the finest single piece about that is the Packers are not moving. Period. And the reason the Packers aren't moving is because the 50,000 owners of the Packers all live in Green Bay, not in Los Angeles. And therefore, you can, as a community, decide the level of investment you want in your local sports facilities. And they did that through referendum, and they decided to raise taxes on themselves to build a new stadium. And a community should be allowed to do that. But it was decided we are going to build this new stadium because we want a new fine facility for our beloved team, not because if you don't build it, we are going to build it.
So from a moral or ethical point of view, at least, it changed the calculus a little bit.
It clearly changed the calculus, and myself and many other sports economists would strongly advocate a situation where you had expanded local ownership, expanded local grassroots ownership of large sports.
I've got a question for Bruce now. We talked a lot about the economic benefits and the lack thereof of stadium constructed by taxpayer subsidy. We talked a little bit earlier about the highway and about the parking lots that are surrounding Turner Field right now. What are some negative effects that you see through the construction process? Is there, you can divide neighborhoods, you can have all sorts of other problems.
Yeah, I mean, look, constructing almost anything can be disruptive. I mean, this includes the stadiums. I mean, any major construction project is going to have these kind of consequences in any city in the country. And there have been plenty of, neighborhoods that have been adversely affected initially by all sorts of urban revitalization development. So it's not solely stadiums. I think there's no question that it behooves the teams involved to be not just pay lip service to this, but seriously try to work with neighborhood people so as to create opportunities that are real rather than just fictitious. This requires, I think, recognizing that, and I know certainly the Falcons are going to be putting some seed money, into Vine City and Avenue, and they did in the Dome too. It didn't work particularly. I think it may be different this time, although the burden of proof is certainly going to be on proof, and that's true because it is the rarer case. Even though, again, that Mark Rosentraub example of some cities where revitalization has certainly been more visible, and whether it's what's happened in downtown Los Angeles, which is the Staples Center, or the great things that happened in Indianapolis, or some of the things that have gone on in Cleveland. There's some examples, even AT&T Park in San Francisco, the Port of San Francisco, that has been out of the way, and there's been some interesting houses as it was near there as well. So
about 95% private finance.
Well, that's true. That's true. But again, that is true. But I mean, some of the dynamics of this thing are related. I think, and the question is probably related to the whole notion of building a gigantic facility, no matter how it's funded, in terms of what happens to the neighborhood. But certainly, there's a clear obligation when there's any kind of public funding to try to reduce the adverse consequences. Rather than lobbying internally in a block for linking up not just the MAR, which of course definitely part of the plan there, but other kinds of streetcar expansion, or whether it's other kind of light public transport that takes people, with even on wheeled trolley cars. All sorts of things have to happen there. Maybe more vertical parking rather than horizontal. It's tough in football because of the tradition of pre-game tailgating. I think let's face it, you can't even tailgate in a vertical deck. And it's a suburban metro area, so you have some natural problems there. I mean, one thing we do know is that the dynamics of how this works can be very different city by city based on all sorts of factors about whether the city is dispersed and whether it's centralized, whether it has dense populations or not dense populations, and so it's harder in a city like Atlanta sometimes to make that work. I agree with that.
If anyone has any questions, I think that Anita has one of the sheets trying to get in. Let Jason or Fred or Nick know, and they can bring it down to me before we wrap up this evening. I've got another question, and I'm just going to read this off for either of you. With the Falcons deal, Georgia will lose its assets at the Georgia Dome, which is a prized revenue-generating landmark, and historical structures that could be great tourist attractions, keeping the area around where the Georgia Dome is. Where the stadium will be constructed. We will have to pay close to $1.2 billion for 30 years, go into debt, and pay for events at the Falcon Stadium. How can this be good? I'll lean it toward you first.
Yeah, well, of course, these are contentions that may not necessarily be completely accurate. I mean, it is true that, first of all, as a publicly owned facility, of course, the Falcons we pay rent back to the Land Development Authority or the Investment Plan Notice we happen to Braves and Falcon. It was also true that the way that the deal was constructed was that the hotel-motel tax, to whatever extent the revenues that are actually earmarked, it's like 39.3%, I think, of the actual percentage from the hotel-motel tax that's earmarked first to the Dome and now extending over the new stadium, would have to be devoted to various upkeep, maintenance, and perhaps further improvements, and to whatever extent, in fact, the actual bond burden, which is currently estimated to be lower per year in terms of debt servicing, lower per year than what we've taken in. That means that the public sector burden is higher, although again, over a period of time, and keeping that facility updated, so it will be owned, of course, by the investment plan, and will not be owned by so, I understand these arguments that are floating around. They've been floated at the bond hearing, and there's some, I think, discrepancy about what actually is going to be happening there. But I think the way that is working, I think there's a legitimate question of whether maybe we should cap perhaps the obligation for the hotel-motel tax. The Falcons obviously already are at risk for these sort of cost overruns, and anything that outdoes the hotel-motel tax revenue earmarked for the stadium would be the Falcons' responsibility. You can always argue the deal could have been somewhat renegotiated in some way. That's always the case. Remember the attorney that actually was opposed to the bond, the one that's the lead attorney at the bond hearing here in Atlanta, was also spent 6 years complaining about the, I shouldn't say that, I don't say the negative, 6 years challenging the tax allocation district financing for the Beltline. I think everybody recognizes the Beltline is going to be transformational for Atlanta, so I'm not quite sure that those arguments automatically would win the day. So that's a little bit very detailed question on some, I think, issues that are an issue that's somewhat debatable in the way that it's work in the state.
Yeah, let me very briefly add, you can have stadium contracts that are either extraordinarily favorable towards the tenant, or you can have stadium contracts that are actually very protective of the taxpayer. The new Santa Clara Stadium, which is where the San Francisco 49ers are going to start playing as of next year, that stadium is about $1 billion of taxpayer bonds going into that. But it turns out that all of the debt payments on that really are going to be paid for by rent by the 49ers, by personal seat licenses that have been sold, by gaming rights, and by money coming in from the NFL as a direct grant there. So that's the one where you have a fairly good lease deal being signed. But we certainly have lots and lots of examples of really horrific lease deals, which essentially the contract is this: we'll build you a stadium, and why don't you just keep all the money?
Yeah, and actually, segueing from that, if we're talking about expensive, popular buildings such as stadiums, they're popular because people like sports, they're expensive because of building. Wouldn't you think that maybe it's prudent to have a vote among people to say, do you actually want to pay for this?
Well, let me. In general, I'm a fan of referendum, but even as the guy who's I'm the anti-stadium guy here, the stadium bills often win. They win at least because the stadium proponents often outspend the stadium opponents by a huge amount. Because remember, the Falcons owner has a huge vested interest in making sure the deal gets done, while the average Atlanta citizen or good citizen only has a minor tax cost and tax burden that they might have. So, for example, when Jerry Jones built his new stadium for the Cowboys in Arlington, he outspent the opponents by about 20 to 1, while the opponents of the stadium brought guys like me in to argue forcefully against the stadium. Jerry Jones brought in the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, and I lost. I don't know why, but I lost. So I would just say that the referendum, in general, I'm in favor of it, but I don't think this is the fantasy that you're going to automatically say, well, we're never going to have stadium financing after that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue against voting, although there are some problems with voting in terms of how informed the voter is or who's voting. But that's a realistic argument to make. Look, we've had some examples of voting in which I think arguably you look back on it and sort of wish the voting done differently. For example, this would way predate most people here, not everybody, and predate my writing here. Go back to the Marta referendum. I mean, I'm going to share a time voting in that. Let's face it, had that originally been a more comprehensive vote that included more counties, and didn't get involved in racial politics and all sorts of things, which now we look at our presidential system, let's face it, we probably look back and say that vote was, in a way, hampered regulatory for a long time. We just hadn't gone that way. We have this issue like Grady Hospital in 2 counties bearing the whole burden of it's a trauma unit that is widely recognized as top of the line. It benefits more people than just 2 counties. The voting thing, again, I don't want to sound remotely like I'm supporting any kind of hidden agenda or hiding information. I can tell you, I met with Common Cause a number of times. I know those people, I respect those people. I've had great meetings with these people that just continue the conversation. I respect what they do in general about open government, and it's hard to argue against that. Obviously the Braves have had a huge public relations problem with what happened in Cobb County, as have the Cobb County commissioners, because that was an unusual deal. I've written about that as a situation where I think that was a big surprise to everybody, because frankly, it was a big surprise to the Braves. They never planned that. I can't repeat, they never planned that. But that negotiation was going full tilt all the way to summer, last summer, in terms of renegotiating that deal with Turkish Steel. And it had various problems. There were historical problems, and Marta had nothing very liked about it. The war, I was more giving the Braves crap about the Braves shuttle. I mean, between the airport line from Marta and the Braves shuttle, those are the two most profitable operations for Marta. And yet the Braves had a fight. It seems a little bit more. It was ridiculous. They now have much more enlightened leadership at Marta, and even that would work better. But I can tell you right up to late in the game, there was serious discussion about that elevated rail from the Georgia State Marta Station down to Turner Street. So I think it was a surprise that that piece of land became suddenly visible that nobody thought was even feasible. And then the issues about, let's face it, in defense of the secrecy there, because this game has been played so badly by so many people with so much bad faith, the notion that Braves had been going to the Cobb County people as a bargaining chip was something that they weren't familiar with, I believe. And in that sense, I think that having to keep that secret was certainly a sore subject to many people. Right. And by the way, there's probably no president of the United States who would ever be, would not admire how few people were involved in that discussion. I mean, that was almost impossible to imagine. By the way, I'll just go on record. I used to wish the Braves weren't moving from Turner Field. But now the more I look at this Georgia State proposal, it's going to be a win.
Well, I'm going to close with one last question about priorities, because we got a question here about how can we justify funding the state when we have so many homeless people still on the street, hungry people.
This goes again to the obvious question of setting up this whole series of priorities and where are the rates of return higher, and there's no doubt that Atlanta has a very serious homeless population in many cities do. And of course, this question can be asked more generally about all sorts of projects that are going on and all sorts of uses of funding that's going on. And even the role of the private sector, why is it working better with the private sector? We seem to have an obligation in this regard as well. So, I a long-time mid-towner who lives not that far away from one of the most contentious of the areas there, where the homeless shelter problem has been an ongoing debate. And of course, the homeless problem in general is so almost seemingly intractable. I'm not going to throw money at it, it's going to be a solution, but nevertheless, it's a point well taken. I'm not sure that if you ask that question about all sorts of public use of funding, it becomes the same issue. And again, remember, one thing that has to, I think, be recognized, and Victor's implicitly conceded this point in a very fair way, while sticking his guns on, I think, the very good points he's made throughout this discussion, is that we do have an awful lot of private sector money coming in. I mean, these projects, by and large, while they do have public funding, the NFL does throw a lot in. A lot of it's coming in from the team. A lot of it's coming in from other sources which are not taxpayer financed. And the city does get, these facilities, we get a lot of publicity. I mean, there's issues that there's big debates about exactly how much advertising value is there when you see your stadium hosting events. It can't be zero. It's no doubt overstated, but clearly, and some cities stand to benefit much more than others from advertising. Some people don't need advertising, okay? New York doesn't need it. Detroit needs it. Anything favorable about Detroit is a big deal, right? So you look at this against a case-by-case basis and try to figure out when a project comes up and you can make a justification on present value cost benefit grounds, and again, it depends partly what you're using as a criteria. Is it a matter of enough tax money coming back to compensate the tax money going out, or is it a broader measure of the regional economic impact, personal income down? That's part of the question as well. But, I certainly would not want to think, I don't think it would be accurate to think that you could raise either the homeless problem or any other problem and say, because those are serious problems, we should never accept some of these opportunities for public-private partnerships. We can make the same argument about having a beltline. We can make the same argument about having an aquarium. And of course, it was largely private money as well, but there was some public money for the infrastructure around the aquarium, and that's a very different neighborhood now. Anyone who knows Atlanta knows that. Dramatically different. Could be better. Still not enough people living there. Still more or less tourists coming in and out, although a lot of people from Atlanta and the region coming in there as well. But that area of the city, it's just transformational what's happening.
And I'd only add to this, so what I just said, wasn't that a little controversial note here, is that many of the other things Bruce is talking about, the agrarian area, the barter subsidies, all these, this is money going from the typical taxpayer right back into benefits the typical taxpayer. Sports subsidies are money coming out of the typical taxpayer's pockets, going into the pockets of millionaire players and billionaire owners, and I think I would find that.
Well, on that note, we're going to close everything. I would say that from my vantage point up here, I sort of had proof of the adage of the two-handed economist, when you have on one hand and then on the other. So, you know, when we talk about having a debate on this kind of topic, it's really enjoyable to have such thoughtful commentary and debate. So thank you both very much.
Yes, thank you both so very much. I thank all three of you guys very much for coming tonight and for participating in our event and giving a presentation. It was absolutely incredible. I don't know about anyone else out there, but I certainly learned a lot more about the topic than I may have known before. Definitely want to thank a couple organizations. This event wouldn't have been possible without the Arthur M. Group Foundation for their generous grant, which enabled us to be able to rent out the facility and bring everyone in, as well as to give Professor Matheson the opportunity to travel on down here and to come to the event. So certainly appreciated his travel time and his efforts in coming down here.
What about my walking expenses for that?
And of course, I'd also like to thank Dr. Seaman as well for coming over here to give his perspective on the debate, as well as for Mr. Richard Warren to moderate the whole event for us. We also want to thank the Foundation for Economic Education for providing the AV equipment and as well as their support. You can see their website at see.org. And I would also like to thank the Georgia Pacific for the venue. Once again, I'd like to thank the debaters, Dr. Bruce Seaman from Georgia State University and Dr. Richard Matheson from College of Holy Cross. Our moderator, Richard Roy, from P. And then I'd also like to thank the Atlanta chapter leadership, because without these guys' help in organizing this whole thing, this wouldn't have been possible either. That'd be Jason Riddle, Fred Barnett, Tim Eubank, Quinn Arno, Michael Beeman, Jake Pogioli, and Jeff Oakland. I'd like to thank the videographer Steve Patterson and the photographer Jake Porter for recording the event, as well as the members of the media in attendance, and as well as you guys in the audience. Really appreciate you guys taking a good chunk of your Tuesday night out to fight traffic, to come down to downtown Atlanta and find your way here. We have a couple events coming up. Our next event is going to be May 27th at the Hudson Grill in Midtown from 6:30 to 8:30. That speaker at that event is actually going to be Steve Patterson, our videographer, who will be giving us a discussion on the limits of liberty, just how far can we go. And then we also have a tentative event coming up in June on June 21st. It's a Saturday. It's an economics boot camp with Dr. Denise Froning from the Charles Cook Institute. So we'll start getting that out and give you guys more details on that once some more of the details are firmed up. But again, that's a tentative date for Saturday, June 21st. For more information, you guys can check us out on Facebook at facebook.com/AFS-Atlanta, or you can check us out at americasfuture.org/Atlanta. Once again, we really appreciate all of you guys coming out here, and as well as our presenters. Everyone have a good night.